The courtroom was so quiet that you could hear the ticking of the old clock above the judge's bench. Reporters leaned forward with their pens ready, lawyers whispered behind their folders, and the air was thick with judgment. Then from the back of the room, a small voice broke the silence like a crack of thunder. "Free my boss!" the little girl cried, her voice trembling but brave. "And I'll heal you." Every head turned. A collective gasp rippled through the room. For a moment no one understood what they'd heard. Then came the laughter, cold, cutting laughter that bounced off the marble walls. "Heal him?" One lawyer chuckled. "The judge hasn't walked in 15 years, kid." Another voice chimed in. "Guess we've got a miracle worker now." Even the bailiff smiled nervously. To them, it was nothing but a child's fantasy, a desperate attempt to save a doomed man. At the defense table sat Ethan Reed, once a respected businessman, now a prisoner in handcuffs. His eyes were red, his face pale. Next to him, his attorney whispered for him to stay quiet, but Ethan couldn't. "Please," he called softly to the girl. "Sophia, don't do this." But Sophia Alvarez didn't move. Her mother, Lucia, the maid who had worked for Ethan's family for over a decade, pressed her shaking hands together. Her face burned with shame and fear. The judge, Henry Wallace, known across the city for his harsh rulings and colder heart, stared down from his wheelchair. His grey eyes hardened as he spoke. "This is a courtroom, not a church," he said flatly. "Your father's boss will be sentenced, and no amount of childish talk about miracles will change that." The courtroom murmured with approval. To them, justice was being served. To Sophia, it was something else entirely, but Sophia didn't flinch. She stepped forward, her small sneakers squeaking on the polished floor. Her heart pounded, but her voice was clear. "You don't have to believe me," she said, staring straight into the judge's eyes. "Just let him go, and I'll make you walk again." The courtroom froze once more. Somewhere in the back, a pen dropped to the floor. And for the first time in 15 years, Judge Wallace couldn't find the words to reply. No one in that room knew that this little girl's promise would soon defy everything they believed in. Before this day in court, Sophia had never seen her mother cry. Lucia Alvarez was the kind of woman who smiled through storms, the kind who'd work double shifts and still find time to braid her daughter's hair before school. But when the police took Ethan Reed away, something inside her broke. Sophia remembered her mother on her knees, begging the officers to believe that Ethan was innocent. They didn't. No one ever believed people like them. The maid, the single mother, the invisible ones. Ethan had always treated Lucia and her daughter like family. While others ignored them, he had given Lucia days off when Sophia was sick, paid for the girls' school books, even fixed their broken washing machine himself. He was no saint, but he was a good man, and that was exactly why his arrest felt like a betrayal of everything decent. The newspapers called him corrupt. The prosecutors painted him as greedy. Yet deep down, Sophia knew he wasn't like the others who looked down on them. At night, when her mother thought she was asleep, Sophia would pray by the window. "Please, God," she whispered, "make them see the truth. Help him and help Mama stop crying." Her faith wasn't complicated. It was raw and pure, the kind only children and the broken-hearted truly understand. Lucia would often tell her, "Kindness always finds its way back, my little one. Maybe not tomorrow, maybe not the way we expect, but it comes." Those words became the light Sophia held on to when everything else turned dark. The day of the trial came like a nightmare. Reporters swarmed the courthouse, shouting questions and flashing cameras. Lucia tried to keep Sophia home, but the girl refused. "He needs me," she said, clutching her small rosary. Her mother had no idea that her daughter planned to do the unthinkable, to stand before the city's coldest judge and promise him a miracle. But Sophia's heart knew no fear. She believed that when truth and faith met, even the impossible could bow. Back in the present, the laughter in the courtroom still echoed. But Sophia's eyes didn't waver. She looked at Judge Wallace not with anger but with pity. Maybe, she thought, he needed healing just as much as Ethan did. And that was when something shifted in the air, something invisible, like a quiet current stirring before a storm. But what happened next would turn that courtroom into the stage for something no one could explain. Judge Wallace leaned forward slightly, his expression hard as steel. "Young lady," he said, his voice calm but sharp enough to cut glass, "you seem to think this is a game. This man," he pointed toward Ethan with the tip of his pen, "has broken the law, and the law does not bend for emotions or childish fantasies." His tone dripped with authority, but behind his eyes something flickered, doubt, or perhaps fear of what he couldn't control. Lucia tried to rise from her seat in the back. Whispering in panic, "Sophia, please sit down. You don't know what you're saying." But her daughter didn't move. The little girl stood tall, her hands trembling, but her gaze steady. "You don't have to believe me," she said softly, her words echoing across the marble room. "Just give me a chance." The boldness in her tone silenced even the reporters. The judge sighed, resting his hands on the cold wood of his bench. "Fine," he muttered almost to himself. "You have 2 minutes, child. Show me your miracle." The courtroom erupted in nervous laughter again. One man in the audience whispered, "I can't wait to see this." Another snorted, "Maybe she'll make him dance." But their mockery only made Sophia's eyes grow sharper, her resolve harder. Ethan turned in his seat, his wrists clinking against the cuffs. "Sophia, don't," he pleaded. "You've done enough. Please." His voice cracked under the weight of his helplessness. The guards tightened their grip on his shoulders, keeping him still. The sight of him, broken, humiliated, burned into the girl's heart like fire. She couldn't let that be the end, not when she still had hope. Judge Wallace gestured impatiently. "Well, let's see it then," he said, his tone half sarcastic. "The court is waiting." Sophia took a deep breath and began walking toward him. Her footsteps echoed louder than the murmurs. Every pair of eyes followed her, the crowd, the lawyers, the journalists, even the guards, as if the world itself had stopped to see whether faith could truly stand against reason. But what she did next silenced even the loudest laughter in that room. Sophia stopped just a few feet away from the judge's bench. The laughter behind her was fading, replaced by the sound of her small heartbeat echoing in her ears. She could feel her mother's eyes on her, filled with fear and love, and for a moment she almost lost her courage. But then she saw Ethan, handcuffed, head bowed, whispering something like a prayer, and that gave her strength. She took one last deep breath and stepped closer. The judge shifted in his wheelchair, frowning. "This is absurd," he muttered. But when Sophia finally looked up at him, he froze. There was something in her eyes, an honesty so fierce it cut through his skepticism like sunlight through fog. "Sir," she said softly, her voice trembling, "you don't have to believe in me. Just don't stop me." The room fell completely silent. Even the sound of the camera shutters stopped. Her small hands rose slowly. The faint tremor in her fingers betrayed her nerves, but her expression was pure determination. "You've forgotten what mercy feels like," she whispered, "but I'll remind you." Then she knelt on the marble floor, the coldness seeping through her thin dress. A few people gasped. One woman in the front row whispered, "Dear God, she's serious." Judge Wallace watched her with a strange mix of irritation and unease. Something deep inside him stirred, a memory he didn't want to remember. 15 years in that chair had made him bitter, proud, untouchable. But now a child, the Maid's daughter, was kneeling before him not out of fear, but with a kind of love he couldn't understand. Sophia closed her eyes. The room held its breath. Her lips began to move, but no sound came out. She wasn't praying loudly or performing for the cameras. It was quiet, personal, like a conversation only she and heaven could hear. And in that fragile silence, even the unbelievers began to feel something shift in the air. And then, in the middle of that impossible silence, something began to move. At first nothing happened. The judge waited with a skeptical smirk tugging at the corner of his mouth, certain this would end in humiliation. The reporters exchanged glances, some already scribbling sarcastic headlines in their notepads. One whispered, "What a waste of time," while another prepared his camera, ready to capture the girl's disappointment. But then a sound, a faint metallic creak from the wheelchair. Judge Wallace blinked. It was so subtle that he almost ignored it, dismissing it as a trick of his imagination. But the next moment, a warmth began to crawl up from his feet, something he hadn't felt in 15 long years. His breathing quickened. A muscle twitched beneath his knee. His eyes widened. "No," he muttered, barely audible. "That's not possible." The laughter died instantly. Even the most cynical faces in the room turned pale. One of the lawyers lowered his pen, whispering, "Did you see that?" The bailiff beside the judge took a hesitant step forward, uncertain whether to intervene or just stand and watch. The entire room seemed to lean toward him, caught between disbelief and awe. Sophia kept her eyes closed, her hands still resting gently on his motionless legs. She didn't look surprised. She looked peaceful, as if she already knew what was coming. "You see, sir," she said softly, "it's not about believing in me. It's about believing again." Her voice carried like a breeze, quiet but powerful enough to make grown men forget to breathe. Judge Wallace grabbed the armrests of his chair, panic rising inside him. He wanted to stop this, to yell at her to step away, but his voice caught in his throat. His body was betraying everything his mind knew to be true. The tremor in his legs grew stronger. He tried to ignore it, but then his right foot moved again, this time clearly, visibly, undeniably. The crowd gasped as if the earth itself had shifted, and in that breathless second, the man who ruled others' fates found his own world turned upside down. Judge Wallace's heart pounded so hard it echoed in his ears. His fingers dug into the armrests, his breath sharp and uneven. "Stop," he whispered, his voice trembling. "That's enough." But Sophia didn't stop. Her eyes were closed, her hands steady, her face glowing with a calm far beyond her years. Around them, the courtroom had fallen into a stunned silence. Not the silence of disbelief anymore, but the silence that comes right before revelation. A woman in the back row covered her mouth. "Dear Lord," she murmured. Reporters froze, cameras hanging limp in their hands. No one dared to move. No one even blinked. The judge's lips parted, but no sound came out. The warmth in his legs was now spreading, alive, pulsing. He could feel the blood rushing, something he'd long forgotten. "No," he muttered again, but his own body defied him. His right foot lifted, clearly, deliberately, before thudding back to the floor. The sound was small, but it was enough to send a shockwave through the room. The crowd gasped. Someone screamed. A few people dropped to their knees, praying aloud. Maria pressed her trembling hands to her heart, tears streaming down her cheeks. Ethan, still in handcuffs, stood frozen, his eyes wide in awe. He didn't understand what he was seeing, but he knew it wasn't human power. It was something divine, something pure. Judge Wallace leaned forward, his hands shaking uncontrollably. "This can't be happening," he whispered. But his face betrayed him. The pride was gone, replaced by raw, childlike fear. He had lived so long behind the armor of logic, and now that armor was cracking open. He looked at Sophia, still kneeling, still unshaken, and something inside him broke completely. The little girl finally opened her eyes and looked up at him. "I told you," she said gently, her voice steady as sunlight. "You can walk again." And for a heartbeat he believed her. For the first time in 15 years, he truly believed, and when he tried to deny it one last time, the miracle went even further. Judge Wallace's breathing came in short bursts, his chest rising and falling as though he'd just run a marathon. His trembling hands clutched the bench as his legs twitched again. Stronger this time, deliberate, impossible. He tried to hold himself down, but the instinct to rise was overpowering. His heart screamed that it was madness, but his body had already decided to obey something greater than reason. The crowd stood frozen, paralyzed between fear and wonder. One of the lawyers dropped his pen, its clatter echoing like a gunshot in the stillness. Reporters forgot to film. Even the guards, always composed, stood in silent awe. Every eye in that room was fixed on the man who for 15 years had lived as proof that miracles didn't exist, now trembling on the edge of one. Sophia stepped back, her small hands folded against her chest. She didn't smile. She simply watched him with quiet certainty, as if she were witnessing something she'd already seen in her dreams. "And it's okay," she whispered. "Don't be afraid." Her voice carried across the chamber like a prayer that refused to fade. For the first time, the judge didn't argue. He closed his eyes and let go. With a deep, broken breath, Judge Wallace pushed against the armrests. The wheels squealed as the chair shifted backward, his knees locked, shaking under the weight of years. The tension in the room was unbearable. Maria clung to her daughter's rosary, tears soaking her cheeks. Ethan gripped the table in front of him, his wrists trembling in the cuffs. And then the judge rose. Slowly, shakily, but completely. A cry rippled through the courtroom, not one of laughter or disbelief, but something raw and holy. People began to sob openly. The air felt heavy, electric. Wallace stood on his own legs, staring down in disbelief, as if afraid that the floor beneath him might vanish. 15 years, he whispered, his voice cracking. 15 years. His words dissolved into a sound, halfway between a sob and a prayer, but what he said next would transform that courtroom into a place no one would ever forget. For a long, trembling moment, no one dared to move. Judge Wallace stood there, his legs shaking under the weight of 15 years of pain and disbelief. The same courtroom that had echoed with mockery minutes ago was now wrapped in stunned silence. Reporters, lawyers, guards, all frozen in time, watching the impossible breathe before their eyes. The judge pressed a trembling hand against the bench, feeling the warmth of life flow through him again. Then he looked at Sophia. The child stood quietly beside her mother, her small fingers clutching the hem of her dress. Tears streaked her cheeks, but her eyes glowed with peace, the kind that comes only from knowing you've done what you were meant to do. For a moment, it felt as though every light in the room had dimmed, except the one that shone on her. Wallace's voice broke the silence. "You didn't just make me stand," he said softly, his tone trembling. "You made me see." He turned to Ethan, still in chains. The man couldn't even lift his gaze. He was crying, silent, disbelieving tears. Wallace swallowed hard, then spoke louder, his voice echoing through the hall. "Ethan Reed," he said, "you are free of all charges." Gasps burst through the room. Maria collapsed into sobs, hugging her daughter so tightly that the child squeaked through her tears. Ethan covered his face, shaking with relief, the cuffs clinking softly as the bailiff rushed to unlock them. Wallace took a deep, trembling breath. "Today," he said, "this court witnessed something no law book could ever explain. We call it a miracle, but maybe it's something simpler. Truth, seen through the eyes of a child." He looked at Sophia again, his eyes filled with gratitude and awe. "You didn't heal my legs, Sophia. You healed my soul." Those words broke what little composure remained. Even the most hardened faces in the room wept openly. As the cameras flashed and the crowd began to clap, Sophia reached for her mother's hand. Together they walked toward Ethan, who dropped to his knees and hugged them both. Behind them, Judge Wallace stood tall for the first time in years, tears shining on his face. He watched them leave, whispering to himself, "Some miracles don't come from heaven. They walk in on tiny feet." That day, justice wasn't written in ink or law. It was written in faith and sealed by the heart of a child.